We're going to be looking at deductive fallacies. Now, a fallacy is a mistake in logic. It's a mistake that we make when trying to reason from premises to conclusion, or in terms of whether just the premise is true or false or not. And so arguments can essentially go wrong in two ways, which means that when we're trying to determine why an argument is bad, it's bad for one of two reasons. Either it's invalid, meaning that the premises do not infer the conclusion, or it is valid, but there's a false premise somewhere, so that the content is not up to par. So either the structure of an argument is bad, or the content is bad. When we're talking about fallacies that are invalid, we refer to these as logical or formal fallacies. Fallacies that have false premises or poor content are referred to as informal fallacies. So we'll go over multiple fallacies within each of these categories. So the formal fallacies that we're going to discuss are affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. These two formal fallacies are mistakes that are made by confusing modus ponens and modus tollens arguments. And so we make the mistake of thinking our premises lead to the conclusion when really they don't. So a modus ponens argument is an argument where we affirm the antecedent of the argument. If P is true, then Q is true. Then we assume that P is true, therefore concluding that Q is true. Modus tollens arguments are denying of the consequent. So if P, then Q, we're denying that Q is true, so P can't be true. So here's an example of both a modus ponens and modus tollens argument. In both of these, the premises infer the conclusion. However, if we were to confuse the second premise in these two particular arguments, then we might not get to the conclusion. In fact, we wouldn't get to the conclusion. We would be creating a fallacious argument. So by confusing modus ponens and modus tollens arguments, we're creating formal or logical fallacies. Here's an example of how that occurs. The modus ponens argument, if P then Q, then we assume that P, therefore, can conclude that Q. This is a valid and good argument. Now, affirming the consequent confuses the affirmation of P with the affirmation of Q, the consequent, and then concludes the antecedent, P. So here, if you look on the right, if P then Q, we assume that Q is true, therefore P is true. But of course, with a modus ponens argument, we can't assume that a Q is true, and therefore P is true, because there could be other reasons why Q is true. This goes back to necessary and sufficient conditions, and recognizing why something is necessary or why something is sufficient of something else. So if this fruit is a banana, then it is yellow. I then tell you that this thing is yellow, therefore it is a banana. This, of course, is invalid. The premises don't lead to the premises do not lead to the conclusion, because there are other things in the world that are yellow. Modus tollens, on the other hand, does the same exact thing, but with the negation of the consequent or negation of the antecedent. Modus tollens, if P then Q, then we say not Q, therefore not P. But when we deny the antecedent rather than the consequent, we don't get to our conclusion. If P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. But Q can happen for other reasons other than P, so we can't necessarily conclude not Q just by assuming that not P is true. Here is an example of that. If this fruit is a banana, then it is yellow. It is not a banana, therefore it is not yellow. But of course, there are other yellow things in the world, so we can't conclude that it's not yellow. So if we look at this argument, what example, what type of fallacy is being expressed here? If he were having an affair, he would buy me flowers. He has bought me flowers. He is having an affair. Pause the video now to determine the answer on your own. The answer to this is affirming the consequent. We've affirmed the Q portion of the first premise, the necessary condition, but remember, this can be necessary for other reasons, and so we can't conclude that he is having an affair. Now, to work this one out on your own, please pause the video now. For this answer, the fallacy is denying the antecedent. If I go out tonight, I'm going to miss my philosophy class tomorrow. I'm not going to go out tonight, therefore I'm not going to miss my philosophy class tomorrow. But just because I don't go out doesn't mean I won't also miss my philosophy class for other reasons, so I can't necessarily get to the conclusion that I'm not going to miss my philosophy class tomorrow. So here we're denying the antecedent, and what looks like a good if-then argument becomes invalid because the premises just do not lead to the conclusion. Now, informal fallacies are perhaps more common, and there are many more of them. We are only going to discuss a few in this class, but there are others in text and others that just will not be discussed. For these informal fallacies, we're essentially saying that one or more of the premises in the argument is false for some particular reason. Therefore, we can't get to our conclusion because one of our premises is false. Now, with the false dilemma or false dichotomy fallacy, we are essentially suggesting that an either-or argument is going to be bad because we are using the two possibilities as exhaustive, whereas in fact there exist other possibilities. For example, if we were to look at this argument, we would see that in standard form, we would be arguing that we must not support the bourgeois ideology, and we get there by thinking that either we must support the bourgeois ideology or we must support the socialist ideology. And we must support the socialist ideology, therefore we must not support the bourgeois ideology. But this, of course, is considering these two ideologies as exhaustive, meaning that there are only two options, bourgeois or socialist, when in fact there are many other ideologies that also exist. So just because you're not part of one doesn't mean you're part of the other. You can be a part of neither, or maybe in some instances, both. But we can't suggest that it's one or the other. And this is why, when we were symbolizing arguments, we wouldn't necessarily symbolize either or arguments with the disjunctive V if the two options were exhaustive of one another. Here again, we have another. To be rich, I've got to inherit money or marry money. I'm not going to inherit money, so I'd better marry money. When we look at our argument here in standard form, we can pick out the first premise is false because it's treating these as two exhaustive options. Whereas, in fact, I can suggest that you can make money by working really hard. So, because there is a third option, we can't just necessarily rely on the fact that if one of these isn't true, the other has to be true, because there are more options than just the two. Now, it is important to note, however, that not all either-or arguments are fallacious. Some really are exhaustive, in that there are only two options. And so we need to be on the lookout for when arguments that have exhaustive options are really exhaustive, or if we're just suggesting they are, but there are really other options as well. So here, let's say I'm going to rob a bank, and I'm looking for people that'll help. And I find you and say, you're either in or you're out. You're not in, so you have to be out. Here, by not being in, you are by definition out. Or if you are in, you are by definition not out. So here you really do only have two options. There's no middle ground. I can't be in a little bit. Right? I can't say, oh, I'm just going to drive the car. I'm not going to really participate. Well, driving the car is participating. You're in. So we need to be careful of whether or not the options are actually exhaustive or not. The next type of argument that we're going to look at, or the next type of fallacy that we're going to look at, is the ad hominem fallacy. Now, there are many types of ad hominems. There's ad hominem circumstantial. There's ad hominem arguments that are just attacking of an individual based on violence or based on fear. But also ad hominem fallacies where we suggest someone is just in a position so they can't be of a sound mind to make a decision. So here's an example of an ad hominem. Again, this ad hominem is just an umbrella term for an attack fallacy, a fallacy in which we are judging the argument by the person who's saying it, not by the merits of the argument. And we can't do that. We always need to make sure that we're judging the argument for the argument. It doesn't matter who says it. Here, we can see Rudy Giuliani is a corrupt and disgusting man. He married his second cousin, for God's sake. We should therefore not pay any attention to his arguments on Trump's legal dilemmas. It often helps when determining the fallacy to put the argument in standard form so that we can highlight which premise is going to be false and why. When we look at the argument in standard form, we can see that the first premise here is not necessarily a true statement. If someone is corrupt and disgusting and marries his or her second cousin, we should not pay attention to his arguments. But why not? Nothing about being corrupt and disgusting suggests that a person must be wrong. So by focusing our attention on somebody's behavior and not on the argument at hand, we are committing a logical fallacy, or an informal fallacy in logic, rather. Here is another instance of perhaps an ad hominem circumstantial fallacy. David Irvin is a Nazi sympathizer, so we can disregard everything he says about the Nazi regime. So given this person's political or social sympathies, he must be lying about that to which he speaks. But the problem is, when we look at this in standard form again, we see that premise 2, everything that a Nazi sympathizer says about the Nazi regime is false, is not necessarily the case. If, for instance, a Nazi sympathizer were to say that Hitler was a good public speaker, this wouldn't be false because somebody is saying something about it that's within the Nazi regime or a Nazi sympathizer. Instead, this is actually just a factual statement, and paying attention to the person saying it because of their position doesn't really negate that what that person is saying is true or false. The next fallacy is the QUOQUE, or the pot calling the kettle black fallacy. This is often also referred to as the hypocrisy fallacy. Here, we're suggesting that because you are being a hypocrite, your argument is bad. So Jefferson was a slaveholder, so we can disregard all his fine words about human equality. Again, when we put this in standard form, we can see that the third premise, if someone claims X but does not act on X, then X is false. This is a false premise. And the reason it's false is because just because somebody's behavior says one thing doesn't mean the argument is wrong. I can express a good argument about something, but not follow through on that argument for many other reasons. Perhaps it's not socially acceptable. Perhaps I'm just weak. Perhaps I just don't want to. And so by suggesting that someone's being a hypocrite, we should not listen to their argument, that is a fallacious, that is a fallacy. We cannot do that. Again, we have to focus our attention on the argument, not the person saying the argument. It doesn't matter who's saying the argument. What matters is the argument. Here's another example of a tu quoque fallacy. America has no right to condemn terrorism. It itself kills innocent civilians and air raids all the time. So here we're saying, because America performs terrorist acts, we then can't condemn terrorism. But this is fallacious. Of course America can condemn terrorism. Anywhere should condemn terrorism. Terrorism is not good. The fact that America does this can be the case for many different reasons. whether it be accident, whether it be for necessary, whether it be for any number of other reasons. It doesn't matter what the reasons are, the argument still holds that terrorism is bad. The next fallacy is the crime by association fallacy. Here, we link two things together, one in which is bad, in hopes of getting the person that we're arguing with to assume that the other thing is bad as well. Here, vegetarianism is a wicked doctrine. Did you know that many Nazis were vegetarians? Here, we're suggesting that vegetarianism is wicked because Nazis were vegetarians and Nazis were wicked. But we can't just assume that every doctrine held by the Nazis was wicked. That would be fallacious. That would be false. So we need to focus our attention on the action. We cannot just associate something bad with something else bad, or we can't associate one thing with something that's bad and then suggest the first thing is bad as well. The next fallacy is the begging the question fallacy. Now, the begging the question fallacy is a type of fallacy in which we assume a premise is true that will lead to our conclusion, but the problem is that that premise is not necessarily true and is controversial, in which case it would require more premises and more argument to prove that premise to be true. So an argument is only as strong as its premises. Therefore, if a premise is weak or uncontroversial, then we would be begging the question. Here's an example of a begging the question fallacy. If we withdraw from Afghanistan now, we will be surrendering to the evil forces of Islamofascism, and we cannot allow that. When we look at the argument in standard form, we see that first premise is false because it's not convincing that that is necessarily true. There would need to be more argument prior to that to persuade the reader or persuade the person being argued with to accept that particular premise. So you cannot have an assumed premise within an argument because that assumption can be wrong, and if that assumption is wrong, then it cannot be used to lead to an eventual conclusion. A type of begging the question argument is the circular argument fallacy, in which case we use the conclusion to support one of the premises that's controversial. Here's an example of that being used in conversation. God exists. How do you know? Because the Bible says so. And why should I believe the Bible? Because it was written by God. And how do I know that God exists? Because the Bible says so. And on and on. So it moves in a circle, suggesting that just because the Bible exists, that's going to prove that God is real. But the controversial premise that the Bible is true or speaks true of God cannot be defended by the fact that God is real. Otherwise, you would be using the conclusion to support a premise, and that's not how arguments work. Here's an example of that argument in standard form, and you can see why one relies on the other, making reference to the idea that a conclusion can support a premise, which it cannot. The next fallacy is the equivocal fallacy, or an equivocal argument fallacy, in which we confuse two terms that may seem the same in order to suggest that the argument is valid, when really our definition of that particular word should be differentiated based on the different uses within a given context. So if we look at this argument, it is not the case, as liberal philosophers often claim, that all human beings have the same rights in all times and places. In many parts of the world, men have the right to beat their wives. In the United States, they do not. So here, the argument relies on us assuming that the word rights in the first and second premise mean the same thing. Human beings have the same rights in all times and places, and in many parts of the world, men have the right to beat their wives. The use of the word right, however, is being used differently in both of these sentences. In the first instance, we're talking about someone's moral rights. In the second sentence, we're talking about someone's legal rights. And so this distinction needs to be made before the argument is put into standard form so that we can see that these premises will not lead to an eventual conclusion because they're essentially different terms, being confused as being the same. Next, misplacing the burden of proof fallacy. Here, it's important to note that it rests on one particular person's shoulders to prove the argument that is being expressed. It's not up to the listener or reader to prove their position. This is, for instance, how courts of law work. You are innocent until proven guilty, because if we were to suggest you are guilty until proven innocent, it just wouldn't make sense. You cannot prove innocence. This is why in the court system, you are either guilty or not guilty. No one's ever innocent, because innocence can't be something necessarily that is able to be proven. So for instance, if we were to look at an argument that goes against common sense, or generally speaking, if we were to look at an argument that asserts the existence of something as opposed to denying it, it would be on that person's shoulders to present the argument. Here's an example of an argument expressed in two ways. Ghosts exist. Nonsense. What do you mean nonsense? Can you prove that ghosts don't exist? Versus, ghosts don't exist. Nonsense. What do you mean nonsense? Can you prove that ghosts do exist? Here, the bottom argument is the accurate argument, because we can expect those that believe in ghosts to prove their position that ghosts are real. We cannot expect someone to prove that something doesn't exist. To prove the negation of something, or to prove that something is non-existent, is virtually impossible and something that's philosophically very problematic. I can't prove that ghosts don't exist necessarily without showing you a list of all the things that exist and seeing that the ghosts are not on there. Or it might be the case that my simply trying to prove that ghosts don't exist will get me to believe that ghosts exist. But in either sense, I can't prove the non-existence of something. The next is the appeal to common practice. And the appeal to common practice essentially says that an argument is fallacious if we are appealing to what people do rather to the argument. So like an ad hominem argument where we focus our attention on the person speaking, here we're focusing our attention on the common practice of society and not the argument itself. We also can refer to this as the bandwagon fallacy. How can you be in favor of slavery? All progressive-minded people think it's wrong. Well, when we look at our argument in standard form, we see that the second premise, every belief that progressive-minded people hold is true, is actually false. Just because people believe something in a majority group doesn't mean that it's actually true. Everyone once believed that the earth was flat. Everyone once believed that the earth revolved, or that the sun revolved around the earth. But just because people believed that didn't make it true. What made it true, that the earth revolved around the sun or that the earth is spherical, is the facts and physics of the universe. Similarly, when we appeal to an authority figure and suggest that the argument is true because this person said it's true, is also fallacious. An argument is not true because somebody says it's true because it factually and scientifically is true. So here, if we look at an argument, contraception is sinful, the Pope has made his views on the subject quite clear, we would see that the second premise, everything that the Pope states is true, is not true, right? Just because the Pope is the authority figure on sin does not make this particular argument true, because we know that this particular individual could be false. So while we use references to support our position from authority figures, we're essentially using those authority figures to support a position based on their research. We are not saying that this particular argument is true because the authority figure said it was true. We're saying this particular argument is true because of all the work that has been done by the authority figure to show why it is true. The next argument is the straw man argument, or the straw man fallacy. And the straw man fallacy is a fallacy in which we misrepresent what a person is saying in order to build back up their argument, but we do so very weakly so that we can then blow it over. So essentially, we're building up this holy argument and then knocking it down. For instance, if I were to argue that feminists want all women to be aggressive and badly dressed, we should ignore their reprehensible views, this argument relies on the fact that I'm claiming that the feminist position is that feminists want people to be aggressive and badly dressed. This is a misrepresentation of what feminists are after. Feminists obviously are after equality, and so by misrepresenting this group, I am then suggesting that all of their beliefs are just as silly as this misrepresentation, therefore we shouldn't believe it. However, by misrepresenting them, I am not putting this group's argument into practice or into full light in terms of the strongest argument I can. So when we summarize an argument and do so poorly by misrepresenting a position, we are committing the straw man fallacy. Here's another example of that. An evolutionary psychologist might say that psychologists think that the mind is a blank slate on which we can imprint whatever we want. This is a clearly absurd position. While the sociologist might say that an evolutionary psychologist thinks that all our traits are determined by genes. This is obviously nonsense. But both of these positions are nonsense because they both misrepresent the particular group in which they're talking about. Sociologists do think that we're a blank slate, but don't believe we can imprint whatever we want. Similarly, evolutionary psychologists think that our traits are determined by genes, but not all of our traits. And so by suggesting that these two groups think what they think as written here, we are misrepresenting them and showing why the position is absurd. If we were to accurately represent these two groups, we would see that their positions are actually very similar. Lastly is the red herring fallacy. The red herring fallacy is a fallacy in which we express two arguments that are not related but sound like they're related in hopes of confusing the person we're arguing with to get confused or think about something else. So here, if I were to argue, I think that all references to sex should be eliminated from films and music. Premarital sex and out-of-wedlock childbirths are creating moral decay in our society. You might think these have to do with one another, but neither of these will infer any conclusion from one another. In fact, these are very different topics that we're talking about, even though they both relate to sex. If these two premises, or if these two propositions are not going to relate to one another, they are going to require their own independent set of premises or argument to argue for them, and these are not going to support one another. So we often find red herring arguments when multiple propositions talk about something similarly, but do not support one another, in which case we are talking about two very different things, suggesting that I'm going to argue this, but hey, look over here and pay attention to that, and I can kind of confuse you into thinking that these things are the same when really they are not.